Okay, so today I'm in the Star Sports Mayfair office with Lydia Hislop. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us, Lydia.
Thanks, Simon.
It's taken a while, but we got there in the end.
It did, I'm sorry about that.
Now I'm going to go, I was told by this gentleman to go straight into something punchy. The late, great John McCurrick described the current racing press to me as supine. Now, would you agree with that?
Well, I'm hardly going to slag off my colleagues, even though John McCurrick did. I would say that there are times when issues could be pushed or discussed more than they are, that some people are more proactive than others, but that's only natural, isn't it, in a job? We have lots of different characters, and you can get lots of different things out of different people depending on how you are, whether you're, pushy, nudging, goading them into an answer, or really sort of asking them a difficult question, or sort of cajoling them into it. You can often get more. So there's lots of different ways to skin a cat. I mean, I don't know, I think it was very easy for John to say that. I mean, I was a huge admirer of John, absolutely, particularly in his early days with his campaigning journalism. He did some fantastic things. He was also excellent at the start of Channel 4 Racing. But towards the end of his career, I would say there were people within the press room who would challenge more than he did, to be perfectly honest. Maybe that's just the passing of time. Maybe that fate awaits everybody. I better know when to retire. It's probably my conclusion for all of that.
Well, one of those people, I think most people would agree, was you, because you have a reputation for asking the questions that others won't. I mean, does that make your job unpleasant at times?
Yes.
And how do you feel about those? I know you don't want to say things about the members of the press, but how do you feel about those that won't ask the questions, leaving it for somebody like you to do the dirty work?
Well, you are sometimes conscious that lots of people are sort of gathering around your interview and taking the quotes, having not asked the question. But I mean, that is partly just how the racing media works to some degree in terms of timing of access. I don't know any other way of doing this job, so it wouldn't really cross my mind to do it a different way. I mean, I think you have to ask questions, be curious, test the evidence, challenge, where appropriate, be fair about it and be balanced. But that to me is the job. So I don't really look at other people and think, is there a different way? Because it wouldn't give me any job satisfaction to do it a different way.
Okay, and when I was trawling the internet to do research for this, I was quite surprised to read that you said that, hopefully it's a correct quote, that confidence is sometimes an illusion on TV. Now, your confidence appears to be bulletproof.
People who appear confident, I look at other people and think, wow, they're confident. And I think they look bulletproof. Well, it is partly illusion, isn't it? We all have a front, even in our real lives, let alone when we're actually working on television, when we're a form of ourselves. We're not completely ourselves. We couldn't possibly be. It's a sort of professional TV form. So am I completely confident? No, I have to often force myself to be. And there'll be good days and there'll be bad days. You'll wake up sometimes and you won't be feeling particularly confident. You won't be feeling particularly great. But, it's the 2,000 guineas. Oh, it wasn't the 2,000 guineas, but, for example, it's the 2,000 guineas that day. And so you have to forget about that, don't you? You just have to do the job properly again. It's just back to doing the job properly.
Yeah, and a lot of the racing stuff, obviously, by nature, is spontaneous. So you don't have the luxury of preparing your questions. Obviously makes it a lot more difficult?
I like that. I like reacting to events. I mean, my background is in print journalism, and so once I moved onto television, the immediacy of being able to ask a question and get an answer straight away was really appealing to me. So I actually quite like that. So I think if you know your subject, you can be ahead of it. You can push the storyline. You can move the news forward. Because you know your subject, you can react instantly.
Okay, now going away from that briefly, you're a trustee of the British Racing School. So what does that entail?
Well, on paper, it involves you meeting 4 times a year with your fellow trustees to talk about what the organisation, the charity, is doing. I've got a particular responsibility for safeguarding and for diversity and inclusion and equality. It's to do with meeting with the people who work at the British Racing School who are particularly responsible for trying to push forward those areas. It's just making sure that the school can be as good as it can be in terms of taking young people and making them employable in the racing industry. They're guaranteed a job at the end of the foundation course, and we take people who have never sat on a horse before. So to do that, to get from there to being able to be an employee within 14 weeks is quite a feat, and I don't think that should be underestimated. You can then go back to the British Racing School and improve your learning in lots of different areas after that foundation course. But it's a great place to be. I think I find it really rewarding, and I've been a trustee there for longer than I care to remember.
Okay, I read that you've helped jockeys to communicate. So is that part of that role, or is
no,
that
that's slightly different. So I did a Paul Bitter, when he was the chief executive of the British Horse Racing Authority, asked me to do a benchmarking exercise on how other racing jurisdictions develop their jockeys in all different ways, from being riders to across the whole of what would be required to be an athlete. And so I compared it with different countries around the world and also different sports in Britain. And that came out, I gave a report which formed the basis of the Jockey Training and Development Strategy, which is being pushed forward by the BHA, the British Racing School, the National Horse Racing College Jets today. And then out of that, there was a desire to give more enhanced media training. And so I see all jockeys at licensing, and then also when they're £5 and £3 claimers, and it's just a case of everyone's an individual, and you find these days, because everyone's got a phone, they're used to generally performing in front of camera much more so. They're much more comfortable than they were when I first started doing this in front of camera, as a general rule. Yeah. But there are lots of things that you have to get them to consider, such as the impact of their words, how they're coming across, things that they could improve. But you want to do that without squashing the individuality out of them. I'm not a fan of overly media trained sports people. I think when you're watching it at home, you can tell that, you can see it, you don't feel you're making any kind of connection with the individual. I don't think that's good in the long run. So I encourage young riders to as much as they can express themselves in their own words, and also words appropriate to their generation, because there's kind of like a perceived correct vocabulary in horse racing, and I don't think that's healthy for the long-term future of the sport. I think if we're going to be attracting young people, the young people within this sport should speak like young people and not people 2 or 3 generations older.
Okay, now there have been issues, including with you, trying to interview jockeys post-race, and that some of them not been too keen. Do you think they're duty bound to talk to the media, or should we accept that they're sportsmen first and foremost and they can choose? I
think they do have a duty to communicate to the media. It's not the media. We're called the media for a reason. We're the mediums between them, the participants, and they, the sports fans. So bearing in mind how much fans contribute to the actual fabric of the sport in terms of keeping it financially on its feet and keeping it relevant and giving it its societal contract, making sure that it's a popular sport and that everyone's income is being driven. Yeah, I do think they have got a responsibility to speak to the media who are conveying their words to the wider public. Now, some people will say, well, they can do that directly, but I think that you're getting a product that way. If you introduce a third person, the media, you get that element of challenge or inquisitiveness that you might not get if you are an individual or an entity trying to communicate directly with your audience. I think you get, as an audience, you risk getting a very sanitized, cleaned up, subjective information, whereas if there is somebody who's actually testing that information en route to you, then I think you get a more rounded picture. So yeah, I do think there is a responsibility of participants. I wouldn't want it to be written into the race conditions or anything like that, because then again I think you risk people turning up and going through the motions. And not everybody. If you have a look at other sports where it is in the contract where they have to speak, no matter what's happened, whether they've won or lost, and some of them are very, very good about that. You see others that are going through the motions, don't you, and just answering by rote. I don't think you'd want to do that. I think increasingly people in racing actually do want to engage. I think more and more young jockeys actually actively do want to and do try. And even when things have gone against them, I've been pleasantly surprised recently how many people who have lost in a race have been prepared to communicate, because winning is only one aspect of a race. Just because you haven't won doesn't necessarily mean that you have done something wrong, does it? More often than not, it absolutely doesn't. So in order for the people, fans, to watch the sport, I think people who have, whatever's happened to you in the race, I think is relevant to someone who is wholly interested in horse racing.
Okay, no, not just thinking of jockeys. I suppose it's easier to speak to the winners and the losers in that sort of thing. But not just thinking of jockeys. You've interviewed hundreds of people, maybe thousands. I mean, what is the worst nightmare when conducting those interviews, apart from somebody that don't speak, of course?
When people aren't engaging properly. When you know that you're kind of you're kind of engaging with a hologram, and no matter what you do, you can't seem to get round or past it. I like people being real and trying to make a proper engagement and trying to communicate. I don't see the point otherwise. So those kind of overly manufactured fronts are the ones that I find most difficult, because they're quite difficult to break through, to pierce through. Quite often it's through media training, a sort of defensive media training, otherwise, or it can be an instinct to say nothing. Those are the most frustrating interviews, because you don't get very far.
Okay, and then there's a fair bit of doom and gloom around racing at the minute, with prize money, field sizes, 5-day Cheltenham Festival, that sort of thing. But in the 70s, nearly lost the Grand National. In the 80s, Wayward Lad won a free run of King George, and Derby winners were retired on the spot. So is racing really on the brink now, or has it always been a little bit on the edge?
I think the difference now is that there is international competition, whereas there wasn't to such a great extent then. So if you think about our best flat racing, that's not just in competition with Ireland and France, who at the moment have more money than Britain, are better funded, their system. So already, even within Europe, the two biggest competitors are providing quite a challenge. France have got a lot of money. Their racehorses aren't necessarily, generalisation, as good and deep as Britain's at the moment. Will that last? That's probably cyclical as well. But then if you move into the sort of wider world, there's all sorts of countries around the world, this is flat racing, who've got far more money to throw at races to tempt the best horses to go there, rather than where they might traditionally have gone, which would generally have been primarily Britain. And so whilst at the moment Britain's black type, you know, what you get for finishing in the first four in pattern races and listed races in Britain, is still a kite mark of quality, more usually speaking. It's that relies on all the good horses turning up, and once a few of those horses start going elsewhere, it becomes quite a slippery slope. So at the highest level, I do think that Britain has a challenge that it won't have been facing in the same way in the 70s, and I think there is a supply issue in terms of stayers as well, which I think might feed into jumps racing. I think that Britain and Ireland, I would prefer Britain and Ireland from a jumps perspective, got together and did an Anglo-Irish pattern, because they're the same horses competing against each other out of a very small pool. And I think there is a lot more for a sports fan or someone with some leisure money to spend to go and do something else now other than watch racing. So I think it's more beholden on horse racing to have a competitive and compelling, internationally, globally relevant product, in order to retain people's interests, retain the money that comes through, retain terrestrial TV rights, all of those things that maintain British horse racing's position within society, within the country, at the level that it is, and therefore maintains it at the scale that it is, and enables it still at this stage to play at the top table internationally. I do think that that's a really different context to the 1970s and 1980s. So yeah, I do think it's a bigger challenge.